Amazing Women Speak podcast, inspiring and motivating every Black woman to own, honor, and execute her amazing, individually and collectively, as it was established at birth.
I'm Crystal L. Gunn, founder of the Amazing Woman Network and host of Amazing Women Speak. And do me a favor and share this with your friends so they can join in on this conversation today. Don't keep this information to yourself. Bless somebody tonight, even if you haven't done it before. It's American Heart Month. And since 1963, American Heart Month has been celebrated as a way to educate Americans to join the battle against heart disease. And yet 48% of Black women and 44% of Black men have some form of heart disease. That's almost half. So let's talk about it. I'm excited with who's going to join us today. But American Heart Month and Black America. Michele, welcome back. You were definitely missed last week. Me trying to figure all of this out was funny. So welcome back. Glad to see you again. But let's get this conversation started.
Good evening, Crystal and guest. I am happy to be back. My name is Michele Harper. I have the pleasure of being the co-host of these amazing conversations where each week we take an opportunity to unpack all of the ways in which we continue to be socialized to live out of something that's not called our greatness, and how we invite each other each week in to be into that space and to fully live and honor everything about us as Black people. Super excited once again to have another conversation tonight with two amazing guests that's going to help us unpack and understand and think about what we can do to disrupt the numbers that Crystal shared with us tonight. So let's get right to it. As I say every week, this is the fastest hour of your evening. And so we want to learn who our guests are, learn a little bit about them, and then dive into this conversation. So I'd like to invite in Dr. Cowan.
Hi, Michele. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name is Simone Cowan, and I am a cardiologist here in Detroit. I have affiliations with two major hospital systems in the larger Detroit area, and I've been a physician for close to a decade and a half. I specialize in adult cardiology and have been doing cardiology for the last 9-10 years or so. I also have a practice that I established shortly after COVID. It's in the Rochester area. My business partner and I, who's also an internist, Dr. Merrill Held, we wanted to open more of a preventative kind of clinic or practice. And the name of our practice is called Whole Health Integrative Medicine of Michigan. We stressed a more holistic way of managing medical care and medical problems. We try to encourage our patients to have an open discussion with us as physicians. We take our time with our patients, and we stress overall wellness, from the mind, the spirit, and the physical. We're building that practice in Rochester, as I said, and we've been open for the last year and a half or so. So the more you know, the better you are, and that's our philosophy in our practice. So.
Welcome. Thank you, Dr. Cowan.
Thank you.
Looking forward to hear more of your story.
Yes.
As a Black woman, why you chose the field that you chose and how grateful we are. I'm speaking, I'm sure, for every Black woman who is on right now for the practice that you started. And I am sure you're going to get an uptick in referrals and calls after this conversation, starting with me. Good evening, James Young. Come on in and introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is James Young II. I am a survivor actually of congestive heart failure, systolic heart failure, and cardiomyopathy, as well as chronic kidney disease. All these conditions I was diagnosed with at the same time. And throughout my experience in terms of overcoming those conditions, I've made several lifestyle adaptations in my life that caused me to minimize my medication intake from going from 11 meds to 2 meds, and then also using my story and my experience through the American Heart Association and becoming one of their national heart failure ambassadors to help inspire other patients, newly diagnosed patients, and those who have a prevalence of heart disease to help them, give them motivation and inspiration as well. Also, with my work with the American Heart Association, I sit on several scientific research grant committees where I help decide how funds are allocated to various research projects that more so than not have a lot of elements focusing on African Americans and African American women, African American men, and African American children as relates to cardiovascular disease and everything related to that condition as well. And so that's been my situation for the last 6 years. I've done that. And then also currently I'm a graduate student at Purdue University, where I'm completing my last year in pursuing my master's of public health, in which I hope to further do more work on a more grand level, moving forward once completing that program.
Awesome. Thank you both. Thank you both. Again, like I said, the fastest hour of our day, and I'm clear this one's going to go even faster. Facebook, we invite you into this conversation. Drop your questions, your comments in the chat. We would love to make you a part of this conversation. What I am clear is 48% means if there's 3 people in the room,
Right,
one of you are impacted. So this is a conversation for all of us. And so we just want to dive in. So James, I want to start with you talking a little bit about your history, right? Like, so you listed several things that you got diagnosed, were discovered all at once. And I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable. Was that because of your lack of care prior to, which we know, right, that often Black men don't go to do preventative care, right? And then rarely do they even go once symptoms start to present themselves. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yes, actually, you hit everything on point because number one, I did not have an identified primary care provider for a number of years. Number two, the other issue was my lifestyle at that time. You know, I spent a lot of time, you know, in my socialization, spending a lot of time with my friends, and it being very excessive in terms of drinking, smoking, and bad eating on a constant basis, to the point where I began doing those same activities personally. You know, it became like a dependent thing as well. After a certain period of time, just became a part of my lifestyle. And so what ended up happening was that I would say a range of 3 years leading up to actually identifying a primary care provider, I had classic symptoms. You know, for those who don't or aren't aware, some of those classic symptoms were excessive retaining of fluid in my legs. That was one thing that progressively happened over those course of those 3 years, as well as having trouble breathing, excessive weight gain, and many other things. And actually, you know, I can actually see, and this is what I tell people, like I actually would be fully clothed and I can actually see my heart beating out of my clothes. You know, that's the struggle. Now, the issue is, like you mentioned, Black men. The issue is that because I didn't have or identify a primary care provider at the time, I was doing what you shouldn't do. I was doing self-diagnosis. So I would say in my mind, I would say, well, I'm having sinus issues, or maybe it's allergies or something of that nature. And I would get these over-the-counter prescriptions and, you know, medications, trying to think that that's going to resolve my issue. And it did not resolve the issue, obviously. Ultimately, when things became really bad with me in terms of not being able to sleep at night, the excessive weight gain, I noticed I was gaining weight excessively, you know, within days. Eventually, family member recommended a place, because I did not have, here's another key point, I did not have health insurance at that time. So a family member recommended a facility through a local hospital that, you know, provided care to people who did not have insurance, and they based it on your income. Okay. And then I began going to see that primary care doctor, which became my main doctor up until this point, even today, after 12 years. And once the diagnosis was done, she came back to me and she said, James, there's so much I can do for you in my office. You need to actually go to the hospital eventually. And she kept reiterating that to me until things got really bad with me. And then eventually I went to emergency. Once going into emergency and being tested, the staff cardiologist then came to me and said, first of all, my question to you is, how did you get here? Wow. And I said, well, I walked in, you know. He said, well, are you serious? He said, because your blood pressure right now, your systolic number and your diastolic number are both over 200. Wow. He said, so you literally walked in here. And I said, sure. And he said, amazing. He said, because you're literally a walking stroke right now. He said, if you didn't know. He said, but secondly, let me run down the litany of your diagnosis. And that's when I learned about the systolic heart failure, cardiomyopathy, and the cardiomyopathy specifically was related to alcohol. In fact, he gave the term alcoholic cardiomyopathy because I had so much alcohol in my system, even at that time. That's how they came to that diagnosis. And then, of course, the congestive heart failure as well. And so pretty much I went through 2 different stints in the hospital. I went to a cardiologist specialist, and at that cardiologist specialist, he basically said he wanted to do a defibrillation implantation in me. And so I asked him a question, and I said, what's option B? You know, and I asked that question for a reason, because there has to be another option other than that. And he said, well, you're in bad shape. He said, so I can't see another reason. I said, no, what's option B? And he asked me this real simple question. He said, can you change? And I said, well, how much time do I have to do this change event? You know, and he gave me about 3 months. And he said, I want you to go through, you know, changing your diet and doing a little moderate exercise and, you know, just really changing your lifestyle. And then we'll revisit this in 3 months. And I went through an extreme change in which a lot of doctors saw unusual, because they said I actually went through a lot of the extreme changes and I remained disciplined. And then from that point, when I revisit my cardiologist specialist, he said, wow, this is amazing. He said, your ejection fraction has gone up a little bit. He said, so I want you to continue doing whatever you're doing, continue doing those things, and then we'll continue to monitor you. And so that's what I continued to do. And because I realized I was rock bottom at that point, and I said, well, there's so many things I want to do in my life. And I hate the fact that I got to this point health-wise, but you know, I made all the changes I could to improve myself. And like I said, again, on the offset, I went from 11 to 12 medications down to 2 over that period of time, within a year, you know, after continuing doing my lifestyle changes and whatnot. So that's in essence, you know, and then ultimately, you know, after some years, I ended up volunteering with the American Heart Association, and then they made me one of their national ambassadors, and, you know, and then things went on from there, you know. So that's in essence the beginnings of my story.
Wow, incredible. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being vulnerable. So often we hold these stories and we hold these experiences out of shame, embarrassment, or whatever, knowing that our story could be the very thing that could change somebody else's life. So I thank you again for your vulnerability and transparency. Dr.
Sure.
Cowan, start us off with, right, like he gave numbers, and we go in and we get our blood pressure checked, we get our heart rates checked, and they throw these numbers out, and some of us don't even know what they mean.
Sure.
Right? And so we don't know, and they're expecting us to educate ourselves. And so then we go to WebMD and start this self-diagnosis that becomes problematic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about numbers.
All right, so let's kind of get a definition of what heart disease is really, because when people think of heart disease, they mostly think about coronary disease or cardiomyopathies. But when you think of cardiovascular disease, which is akin to heart disease, it's really separated in, you think about the heart and you think about the vasculature, right? So when you look at these myriad of diseases that fall under those 2 umbrellas, you think about peripheral heart disease, you think about cerebral heart disease, you think about coronary artery disease, you think about heart failure, arrhythmias, cardiomyopathies. So there's a vast number of diseases or problems, clinical problems that fall under the umbrella of cardiovascular disease. The risk factors for cardiovascular disease include diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, which is elevated cholesterol, smoking, obesity, lack of physical activity. okay? In terms of the African American population, the major risk factors are hypertension, which typically starts at a very young age and is often very malignant, okay? So I see patients, especially African American men, in their 20s with elevated blood pressures, okay? And it's related to a number of things. It's related to diet, and there's probably a genetic component as well. At one point, there were a lot of studies that were dedicated towards the African American population to determine whether or not we possess a gene that sort of gives us increased salt retention, that makes us more susceptible to hypertension at the younger ages. And so the other risk factor is diabetes, obesity, and lack of physical activity. Almost 60% of women over the age of 20 in the African American population is overweight or obese. Believe that or not, 55 to 60%, okay? And that's a huge risk factor for coronary disease. So when you think about hypertension and you think about blood pressure and you want to know what your numbers are and what is normal, the American Heart Association, the Association of Cardiovascular, the ACC, American Cardiovascular Association, the normal blood pressure should be less than 120/80. Elevated blood pressures are described as anything, your top number, I think James was referring to systolic and diastolic numbers. So the top number is your systolic number, the bottom number is your diastolic number. So normal blood pressure, top number 120, less than 120/80. Elevated blood pressures, 120 to 129/80 or anything greater than 80. Stage 1 hypertension, 130 to 139 systolic numbers or 80 to 89 diastolic numbers, right? Stage 2 hypertension, over 140 to 149 diastolic numbers, over 90 to less than 100. Anything over 110 or 180 systolic or 110 diastolic is malignant hypertension. So when you go to your doctor, they say you have stage 1 hypertension, stage 2 hypertension, malignant hypertension, you kind of will have an idea of what those numbers mean when you go there. When you're looking at your lipid profile, your total cholesterol level should be less than 200. Your triglyceride levels should be less than 150. Your HDL levels should be ideally greater than 50, but no less than 30, okay? And I'm talking about milligrams per deciliter. And your LDL levels should really be the less than 70, less than 100 if you have no risk factors, less than 55 if you have underlying coronary disease. Really, those are the strict guidelines now. Some people still say less than 70 for LDL levels, but when I practice, in my practice, I use less than 55 as my guideline, and that's milligram per deciliter. So I'm very strict with those parameters, just to make sure that everyone is well taken care of.
So we already have a couple questions.
Sure.
So one of them is, how do we beat increased salt retention?
So there was a hypothesis years ago that African Americans possess a gene that causes them to retain salt. And so that's one of the reasons why they develop hypertension at younger ages. So they're thinking that there is a genetic component. I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that all the way, but we seem to develop hypertension in our 20s. And I don't think it's solely related to diet and lack of activity, okay? There's other issues, there's socioeconomic issues, fast food restaurants are in poorer neighborhoods, poor people eat cheaper food. And so there are all these things that play a role. But we have hypertension at a younger age, and we develop malignant forms of hypertension at younger ages. And we develop end organ damages secondary to hypertension at younger ages. So when I say end organ damage, I mean heart failure, like what James was talking about. His heart failure was related to alcohol. It was alcohol induced. But heart failure can also be related to elevated blood pressures over time that are never well controlled. Okay, so if you think of the heart, it is a muscle after all. So if you draw a diagram of the heart, okay, and you cut it into half, so you have a right side and a left side, then you cut it into quarters. That lower left quarter is akin to the left ventricle of the heart. So the left ventricle pumps blood to the whole body, right? So hypertension is the resistance to that flow. So if you think of the heart, which it is a muscle. If you're pushing against resistance over time, that muscle thickens, okay? And when it thickens, that cavity, now remember, you're percolating a certain liter of blood through the body every single time. That liter and amount of blood doesn't change, but when that cavity size gets smaller and smaller, then you start to develop heart failure-like symptoms. So as James mentioned, you start to retain fluid, you get short of breath, you're coughing, you can't lay flat, you get edema in the legs, edema in the belly, right? Eventually that heart is compensating for that blood pressure that it's pushing against. Okay, so it gets thick over time and then it dilates over time and gets bigger and bigger. And then you develop a different kind of heart failure called systolic heart failure, which is what James had, but his pathophysiology was a little bit different. Okay, so it's just, I mean, it's a spectrum of disorder that starts with uncontrolled levels of hypertension, which is related to obesity, lack of activity, diet, and perhaps a genetic component that leads to this end organ damage, whether it be kidney or heart or strokes over time. You know, this is what develops down the road.
Thank you. So James, go in, you get this diagnosis, you're like, nope, let's talk about plan B. And you got serious, right? Which oftentimes hearing that kind of news, right? Like we're still trying to push the boundaries. What made you say, I have to, and right now, right? Like to be able to cut off the things that you cut off, to be able to make that kind of turn in 3 months. What
Absolutely. Happened? Yes. Well, it was that initial conversation I had with the cardiologist once I was an inpatient. And then I did some, you know, I know you mentioned Googling, earlier on. So I did a little Googling because I was ignorant about what heart disease was. I was ignorant about what congestive heart failure, all of my diagnoses. In fact, in addition to the heart condition diagnosis, I was also, chronic kidney disease was one of my diagnoses. Diabetes was another. And as the doctor mentioned, I also too had an enlarged heart as well. And so I did a lot of, since I had to spend a lot of time in the bed in the hospital, so I did a lot of reading. And then once I met with the specialist, and he really gave me a hard talking to. And he said, you're a young guy, because at the time I was 40 when I was diagnosed, right? And that goes to a whole nother conversation, which I'm sure the doctor can expound on as far as how these chronic conditions are happening younger and younger ages, particularly within our population. But nonetheless, when I got the talking to from my specialist, he said, listen, we're going to go ahead and do this defibrillation if you don't get, pretty much your act together. And so he said, pretty much, what you're doing. He says, it's not like you're just totally oblivious to what you're doing. You know exactly what you're putting into your body. The alcohol you're drinking and the amounts you're drinking. You're totally cognizant of that. He said, so you actually know what you need to do, right? And he was right. He was very true. And so what I ended up doing, which a lot of doctors I've met with still think is unusual, because of the behavioral shift I made, and that was pretty much like I stopped going to fast food restaurants. I was one of those folks. There was one Popeye's chicken I would go to, and I would go to that Popeye's chicken, and I would go there so often. And I tell people this story. I'll go there so often, I'll go to the drive-thru, and they would actually know who I am. Wow. They knew exactly what I wanted. Oh, James? Oh, they didn't know my name, but they said, oh, number 3, you want the number 3? The number 3 with lemonade and the fries, and you want it spicy? Right. That's how consistent I was going to this Popeye's chicken, right? So, obviously I knew what I was doing to myself. So I actually stopped doing that. And then I began incorporating more plant-based foods in my diet. So what I often tell people is like, especially if you're going to work out, don't try to lift the entire gym when you go work out, or when you're trying to eat right, don't try to eat everything, in the produce section. Take baby steps. And that's what I did. I took baby steps. So I started with breakfast, since, that's the first meal I eat of the day. And I made that more plant-based focused. So I've been consistent with that for the last 12 years. So every morning I eat, kale, or I eat spinach for breakfast. You know, I might have avocado with it or something like that. For lunch, I do salads. You know, eventually I just build on one thing and I just continue to build on, you know, from one meal to the other. And it made more sense for me to do it that way. So that was one major change I made right there. Second was hydration, because I wasn't drinking water at all prior to my diagnosis. I mean, I was drinking pop, I was drinking sugary drinks, obviously alcohol, because I was diagnosed with alcoholic cardiomyopathy. And so I started going to a place here in Detroit, and I know Crystal may be familiar with this place, the water station on Woodward. I started going there, and I met the late Dr. Kifa Weatherspoon, and then she educated me on the importance of hydration and drinking water every day, and how our bodies are over 70% water. And, you know, it's very important for us to get that in our system. And so I started doing that, and I still do that today. Like I still have, like, in fact, right here, you can see, I have a gallon of water. I mean, that's just something that I have taken as a habit, you know, over the years to, you know, improve myself. And then in addition to that, obviously, was physical activity and things like that. And I started going to Martin Luther King Junior High School on the east side of Detroit, and I started walking around there. And that then helped me, you know, to better my health condition. And that really helped me far more than anything else, was really my physical activity improvement, doing that. And so those were two of the major things I did. And I'm telling you, my primary care doctor, who I still have today for the past 12 years, she's amazed at me. She calls me, she says I'm one of her classic patients. You know, she often tells her patients about me, you know, as far as all the changes I've made and the improvements I made over time. So yeah, so those are some things I did for myself to, you know, to curtail my diagnosis.
That is incredible. So, Dr. Howe, we have a question in the chat, and I'm hoping that it layers the question that I wanted to ask you, right?
Sure.
So James talked about he could see the direct connection. He knew what he was doing, right? Some of us don't know, right? Like it's not as clear. And so again, I'm not sure if this question I'm asking layers, and if not, please answer both ends of them. We've got someone on Facebook asking about environmental factors like stress on my job. What kind of impact does that have on us for the things that we can't see, the invisible indicators?
Absolutely. So stress and hypertension and stress and just your physical wellness in general, you know, just play a role on your overall health. So stress can increase your blood pressure. Your blood pressure kind of is labile throughout the day. It varies. I shouldn't say labile, but it varies throughout the course of the day. So you compound things like activity and stress and all that. It does elevate your pressures over time. So let's say someone has hypertension and it's not well controlled, right? Can you imagine just, you know, your blood pressure at the beginning of the morning is usually the highest of the day. And then it tends to sort of taper off a little bit throughout the mid-course of the evening. And then in the evening, it rises again. And then when you go to bed is when it's at its lowest. So there's this diurnal kind of pattern to the way that the blood pressure flows throughout the day. So if you're hyped up all throughout the day, going to work, you're stressed out with your kids at home, your blood pressure is staying high. Let's say you're a hypertensive patient that is not well controlled to begin with. That blood pressure is up there, and it's insulting the kidneys, the heart, the brain, you know, the vessels actually, right? And it's just hovering on the high throughout the course of the day. By the time you hit time to sleep, you should be coming down, but you're not coming down as far as you should. So your cortisol levels and stress hormones and all that stuff kind of compound the effect of the stress over time. So it does affect the heart. It causes your sympathetic nervous system, this fight and flight kind of hormones, your adrenaline, as we layperson will term it, you know, norepinephrine, epinephrine, those levels stay high over time, and it affects your organs, the heart, the kidneys, you know, the brain, strokes. This is the end organ damage that so stress plays a huge role, believe it or not. And so in our practice, we tend to try to promote techniques to de-stress our patients. So we recommend acupuncture, we recommend yoga, meditation, you know, counseling. Believe it or not, just being able to talk about things, you know, de-stress you a little bit over time, because you may not have anyone else to relate your personal problems or what's going on in the course of the day. Just talk to someone, or you go to acupuncture, you know, just the physical feeling of someone putting needles in you, believe it or not, de-stresses you. Okay. And yoga and meditation, we've all known about the benefits of yoga and meditation over time. So we push those things in our practice, you know. So we practice traditional medicine, medications, help, and we also implement these non-traditional techniques also, because we know that stress plays a huge role in the disease process, right? So yeah, it plays a huge role.
So how did you choose to go into
Cardiology?
cardiology? How did you choose? Did something happen in your family where you decided I needed to put my energy in this space? And then the second part of that question is, right, like you're practicing medicine in a way that most of us don't hear about, right?
Yeah.
You're paying attention to the patient, and you're practicing traditional, non-traditional. The idea that you said we sit down and we listen.
Yeah.
So Doc, before you answer that, because
Sure.
my next question was going to add to that, and maybe you can
Sure.
speak to that. You're a DO, correct?
Yes.
And it's been my experience that I prefer DOs over regular, you know, medical. So when you're answering Michelle's question, can you also speak to the DO? Because I like that concept that you all do. And usually you find that with DOs as opposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my journey is a little bit different from typical, you know, physicians or medical students, right? So this is actually my second career. I was in research for a number of years. You know, when I graduated college, I went to a graduate school, and I did a master's program in molecular biology, and I was doing bench research for 6 years. And then at 32, I said, you know what? I've always loved medicine, you know, and I don't see myself sticking with general research-based scientific part of medicine. So I want to go into clinical medicine. So at 32, I decided to go to medical school.
Wow.
In medical school, I went to an osteopathic program because I was convinced that I wanted to do sports medicine, because I was an athlete. I played soccer, I played tennis, I did everything the boys would do. That was me, you know, on the field with those, you know, I was doing all of that. So I wanted to do sports medicine because I thought that would integrate this athletic part of myself. And I thought that the DO program with its manipulation techniques would be the best place for me. DOs traditionally were primary care physicians. That's what an osteopathic physician was. And we sort of thought about the body as a whole entity, that the mind affects the spirit affects the physicality. And so that still is pervasive in the way that I practice today, you know? I don't do a lot of manipulation anymore because, you know, when I decided to pursue cardiology, you can't really do that in the hospital setting as much. You can do that in your private setting, but not so much in the hospital setting. So when I was a second year medical student, I was on clinical rotations in my third year, and I was sort of vacillating between whether or not I wanted to do sports medicine, orthopedic surgery, or I wanted to go into cardiology. And I took this rotation in Bay City, Michigan. It was in a hospital. I had a great preceptor. And I said, boy, I really my brain is very scientific. And I think about plumbing and the physics of plumbing and all of that stuff. So cardiology and nephrology kind of, you know, were of the most interest to me at the time. And then I had a patient who was a 20-year-old female, African-American lady. And she came in sort of similar to James's presentation, in heart failure. She was young, she had one child. She developed a postpartum cardiomyopathy after her pregnancy, within weeks of her pregnancy. And I just kind of had this attachment to this one patient, you know. It was my one patient on my internal medicine rotation, on my cardiology rotation, sorry, that I would go in and see every day. That was my patient that I was responsible for. And I just had an attachment to her. And that was the one thing that sort of pushed me in that direction. And I said, you know what, I really want to do this. I like the clinical side of it. I like the scientific part of the heart and the heart's role in the body. And think this would be the right spot for me. I don't think I can do general medicine. I need to focus on one thing because that's just me. Got to focus on one thing, and I think I can do this well. And so I decided to pursue that. So I did finish my medical school 4 years, and I went and did my internal medicine rotation because you have to do internal medicine in order to specialize. So I did 3 years of that, and I did it here at one of the Ascension Health facilities in Detroit. And then I said I wanted to go and do cardiology, and I knew that I was going to be a general cardiologist. I didn't want to go put in stents and all this kind of stuff because I wanted to. That wasn't me. So I wanted to sit and talk to my patients. But when I started to practice medicine, I realized there's a time crunch here, Simone. You can't spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes with a patient answering their questions. You have to go in kind of knowing what you want to do ahead of time and sort of adjusting things based on what the patient tells you. But I didn't like that aspect of medicine so much. So I did my 6 years with that. And then I said, you know what? I took a break. And then when I was going back to medicine, I said, I don't want to practice like that anymore. I want to be able to spend as much time as possible with my patients. So my patients, new patients that I see in the office now, have an hour visit. I practically do everything in my office, you know? They come and they see me, it's an hour's visit. I talk about pathology because I think when you know about your disease process, the more likely you are to stick with medications, the more likely you are to follow the plan. And so I sit there and I explain things. I say, this is the medication that I'm starting. This is why I'm starting it. This is the dose I'm starting and why I'm starting at this dose. And I explain that we are going to change things if we don't see any improvement. I give them an idea of the plan 3 months down the road so they know what to anticipate. And so they follow the plan. They follow the plan. So we sit there and I answer and I address all their questions. I'm very open to them. They can text me at any time. There's an app that we use where we connect with each other. We can, you text me if there's a problem, you text me. So when you come to see me in our visits, they're very focused because I already know what's going on because we're communicating in the interim, So our visits are very focused and, if there's a problem, we've already addressed that probably before you even get there because we're always communicating. So my response time is very quick. When a patient tells me there's a problem, I get it, a text message, and I respond within a couple of hours of receiving that. It doesn't matter what time of day it is. And I also make some home visits, I make house visits I make home visits to older patients.
They're a unicorn.
Oh my God, there are a couple of older patients that I used to see. So my office is in Rochester and these patients are in Grosse Pointe. And I used to see them in my former practice. And they found me when I decided to come back.
Yeah.
And they said, we've been looking for you and here you are. And I said, okay, it's going to be a trip for you to come all the way up to Rochester. So I'll come to your house and I'll see you there. If you have to come to the office for anything in particular, we'll limit those visits, but I'll come to your house. And there's nothing like really seeing a patient in their general home setting. You know what I mean? Because you can really see what they're doing. You can see how the home life is, what support they have. And so there's nothing like this is old school medicine. This is how medicine should be practiced, but the constraints of medicine today, it makes it difficult. So I'm able to do this because this is our practice, right? So I can make it however I want to do it. I can feel like I'm giving back to my community. I can feel like what I'm doing is worth it. And so that's kind of what I wasn't experiencing when I was practicing before. Now I have that feeling, and it's so much more worthwhile for me to do things that way. I may not see 20 odd patients in a day. I may not make millions in the practice, but I'm giving myself to my patients. They're giving something back to me. We're symbiotic in that way. And I enjoy what I'm doing. And that's the key. That's the key. So that's my story.
Bravo to you for that, because I believe that's how medicine should be practiced. And like Michele said, you're definitely a unicorn. But Doc, how can people get in touch with you? Because I'm sure after all of this information you share and the way that you practice, people are definitely going to want to reach out to you. Yeah, so how can they do that?
Yeah, so we have a website. It's called Whole Health Integrative MI. Let me give you this first. This is our email address. So it's wholehealthintegrativemi@gmail.com. Our website is wholehealthmi.com. Okay, you can always reach us that way. Our address is in Rochester. It's in 210 West University Drive, Rochester, Michigan. 48207, I think, is the zip code. Okay, and I'll give you all that information, Crystal, so you can share the
Please
notes at
do.
the end. So
Please
if you
do.
missed any of that.
So the chat is blowing up, and right. So I know why you're a unicorn. So Nadine just shared, right, and we appreciate your humility, and we're all about the brags with Black women that you have been Doctor of the Year more than once.
Oh, I
am clear for the reason why. Thank you for the ways in which you practice medicine. So we do have another question. Dr. Cowan, what can parents of student athletes do to have heart health incorporated into sports physical when there is no known heart condition?
Yeah, this has been a debate for years, because at one point they wanted to do, when students are going out for physical activity, at least have a baseline EKG, so that we can see if they're, we know that athletes, sometimes they can have some cardiomyopathies. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the biggest one that we've seen in a lot of athletes, that causes them to have cardiac arrests on the field. And so we're worried about that. And there was a push some time ago to have baseline EKGs done on every kid that wants to be active in sport. Unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition because it wasn't economically feasible, if you know what I mean, to do these things. But sometimes they have these health fairs for students, right? I really encourage it to have one in your area to go out to those fairs, because I know when at Beaumont, okay, they do, which is now Core Health, they do these health fairs, probably 3 of them in a year, something like that, and you'll have general cardiologists that are there, and they kind of modulate the fairs, and you have a number of students that come in, and we've been able to diagnose valvular heart disease, cardiomyopathies, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy on an EKG and with an echo at these fairs, believe it or not. So when there are health fairs that come around, just make it a point to go to these fairs. Unfortunately, we've tried, and the push is there to at least have basic EKGs given to students that want to try out for sports. If you have a family history of some kind of genetic cardiomyopathy or genetic heart disease, it's imperative that you at least have your child see a cardiologist before they want to participate in any kind of sport. So that's imperative on the patient, on the families and parents to go ahead and do that. If you have a known medical condition in your family, have them go and see a cardiologist or at least a general physician before they try out for sports and all that. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
On behalf of our Facebook listeners, Dr. Cowan, I want to thank you. This is medical guidance that folks could not get, right? So again, we get to Googling and don't get information that we need in a way that's most helpful. So thank you for answering these questions for folks. So James, right, like here we are, 7:44, fastest hour of your day.
Right.
No, right, you talked about the ways in which you've gotten involved since your diagnosis, since you've been paying attention to a better lifestyle. Tell me about the impacts of those involvements that they've had on your life and your ability to stay in it.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, my initiating into the American Heart Association volunteer situation came about when my father passed away in 2014. He passed away due to congestive heart failure and diabetic complications. And from that inspired me to want to do more in terms of advocacy. Of course, initially I was doing like Facebook posts and stuff like that, but I wanted to become part of something that was bigger than me. So I reached out to the local American Heart Association here in Southfield, Michigan, and then they put me to work immediately after hearing my story. And at that time, Ebony Magazine had just did a story on me as well, so they were familiar with my story to a certain degree from that article. However, after doing so many speaking engagements, did some television, radio, they moved me to the national office in Dallas. And then from there, I became the national ambassador. And then soon after that, they moved me to the research operations of AHA, where I was a guinea pig. They called me a lay stakeholder in science. And this was their way of involving non-scientists into the discussions of scientific grant applications, because they figured that voice was very important as they discussed these various research projects proposed by many universities around the country. To have that voice from a person who has experience with heart disease or who is familiar with a certain community to speak to those issues and provide that perspective in deciding on how these funds will be allocated. And so that's majorly the role I've been playing with the American Heart for the past 6 years, is sitting on these multitude of committees. In fact, 2 weeks from now, I'll be sitting on a committee dealing with cyclostressors and how it relates to cardiovascular disease among African Americans. So these are the type of projects that I've been working on that ultimately inspired me to do what I'm doing now in terms of pursuing my MPH, my master's in public health at Purdue University, was being around folks like the cardiologists we have here, the good sister here, and others, that I've been around with the American Heart, inspired me to really level up in terms of really becoming credentialed in the field of public health, so I can have even a greater impact, particularly within our community.
That is incredible. Thank you.
Yes.
I need to get this last question in. It's come through twice, and if I don't, I am sure I'll get a message about it later. Dr. Cowan, blood enzymes. Should we be asking our doctors those kind of questions?
So when you say blood enzymes, what specifically are they referring to? So sometimes, you could look for cardiac markers, troponin levels and so forth. And I mean, we don't check those things necessarily unless there is a symptom and changes that determine that. And there are different kind of markers that we look for. We can look at basic natriuretic peptide levels to assess volume status in the heart and the body in general. We can look at troponin levels to assess myocardial damage, but these are not sensitive markers. They're kind of non-specific sometimes, so you have to have a context in which you're looking at them. So we just don't order markers unless there is a symptom that sort of pushes us in that direction. The general lab work gives us a general idea of the electrolyte status in the body, what the kidneys are doing, what the blood count is, whether or not you're anemic, if you have an inflammatory state, which is a pro-inflammatory state has been linked to cardiovascular disease. So we sometimes can look for these things to assess whether or not you're at risk. There's certain markers that we can look for in a lipid profile that can give you an idea of whether or not you are at risk for coronary disease. They're not, tried by true markers, but as I said, they're things that can sort of guide us to testing and give us an idea of how quickly we can follow up with patients. And so we don't just randomly test, we have to have a context in which to do some of these testing, so.
All right, Crystal, I saw the lean in.
Well, yeah, there's another question, and I did put the website in the chat, but this question has also come up twice, and it says, my heart flutters every now and then, and I was born with a heart murmur, and I wonder, is that why my heart flutters? And goes on to say, mom died of congestive heart failure, and is that something that she should be looking out for at the age of 63?
So her mother died at the age of 63, or she is 63?
She is 63,
She's
but
63.
her mom died of congestive heart failure.
Yeah, so there are multiple reasons for heart failure, and James alluded to and has a history of, there can be alcoholic, idiopathic heart failure. The main reason for heart failure, especially systolic heart failure, is coronary artery disease. So mom could have had coronary artery disease, or hypertension, as I said, can cause diastolic and systolic heart failure. So mom having heart failure alone, we have to understand why she had heart failure to begin with. If, let's say, she had heart failure because of coronary disease, when did she have coronary disease? Did she have a heart attack? What age did she have it? Because, you know, if you have a family history of early coronary disease, that puts you at risk for early coronary disease. And women that are postmenopausal are at increased risk of coronary artery disease. Your estrogen protects you to a point, and then after that, you know, your risk goes up, right? So her heart is fluttering. There are multiple reasons for that. A thyroid dysfunction can cause it. You know, are you gaining weight? Or you do you have sleep apnea? You know, do you have an underlying other kind of arrhythmia? You know, obesity and sleep apnea go hand in hand with atrial fibrillation and flutter. And so there could be multiple reasons for palpitations. I mean, are you having palpitations because you have underlying disease in the vessels? Are you having palpitations because your electrical milieu of the heart is in disarray? You know, so she definitely needs an assessment for sure to see what's going on, with at least a baseline EKG to see at baseline if there is any arrhythmia, and then maybe a monitor, and then just a baseline echo to see structurally what the heart is doing. And then as she talks to her physician about symptoms and, you know, her risk factors. Does she have hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol issues? Does she smoke? You know, those kind of things increases your risk for coronary artery disease. And then, you know, we sort of add more testing to determine what the risk stratification is and determine what we need to do to best treat her. So she definitely needs to be seen with a baseline EKG and an echo to start.
So I have just another question, because I've heard this on more than one occasion from patients, and mom just brought it to my attention about one of the anchors on CNN was having heart issues. She went in and they're telling her, no, it's acid reflux, it's acid reflux.
Right.
She was having a heart attack. Like,
yeah.
So can you speak to that? But also, when someone is going in because they feel like something is going on with their heart, and we hear it specifically, and I probably hear it more because I am a Black woman, how we are pushed aside and not taking seriously, if you will. Like, what are some things that we should be pushing back on when they say, oh no, it's just this, and you're like, no, it has to be something else? Like, how do we push back to make them pay more attention? And or my next statement is they should just call you, but
yeah. And so that is the part of medicine now that is changing. So there's always been this kind of, especially when it comes to women, this sort of negating the symptoms kind of thing, and not really believing what they're hearing. You know, this has always been, cardiology has always been a male dominated field, right? And so now it's a little bit less so, more of a balance in medicine to begin with. You have more female physicians coming through, and you have more African-American physicians coming through. So, I mean, now we have less of a bias in terms of, you know, how we treat our patient population. That said, women present differently from men, okay, in terms of how their symptoms, right? So the book was never really written for the woman. Okay, so how you have your discomfort, or what we call your anginal equivalent. And when we say anginal, angina is a coronary pain, chest pain that comes from the heart. So that's what we refer to angina. So typically and classically, coronary or anginal pain is substernal pain that can radiate up the neck, to the jaw, to the left arm, down the left arm. Some people even present with just tooth pain, but it's related to pain. They may feel like a pressure sensation in the chest, then they develop some kind of tooth or jaw pain. That's classic anginal pain. 60% of women have classic angina, but 40% of women have shortness of breath as their anginal equivalent. They may have something akin to GERD as their anginal equivalent. So when you go in and you go into a physician and you say, look, I have this heartburn-like sensation, you know, they're going to ask you questions like, okay, so what is it associated with? Is it worse with activity? Does it get worse when you lie down, when you sit up? Is it worse with food? Because there's more in that chest cavity than just the heart, right? So chest pain is not always cardiac pain. You've got an esophagus there, okay? So it could be GI pain. You've got lungs, you've got a rib cage. So it could be a musculoskeletal pain. So these are questions that we ask to sort of focus it so we can decipher and eliminate things that are not cardiac related. But you have to push. You have to push. If you feel something that is out of the ordinary from what you normally experience, you know your body very well, then you have to push. I've had patients who were dismissed, okay, and they had the real deal, and they were dismissed, but they kept pushing and saying, this is not me, this is what I'm feeling, and they pushed the physicians to order the appropriate test, and they ordered the test, and then it was revealed that they had disease. So you have to be your best advocate, and I always tell my patients that you have to push because you know your body. And if somebody doesn't say something that sounds right to you, then move on to the next person. Get a second opinion, okay? Get a second opinion, and you know, just push and advocate for your health, okay? The answers are never always, for some people, it's not always black and white. And so the physician may be doing the right thing, eliminating all these things, and then he comes down to or she comes down to the correct diagnosis. It's not always black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and especially with females, African-American females, because as I said, there's this bias in medicine that, oh my gosh, especially when they're younger, they can't possibly have heart disease. But the younger and younger patients now are having heart disease, legit heart disease, legit coronary disease. My youngest patient was 25 years old. He was a white male, but he was 25 years old with a lot of risk factors, including diabetes, and he had legit coronary disease. Wow. So, I mean, you know, you can't dismiss anything. I just try not to dismiss anything these days, even if it doesn't sound like classic pain, because as I said, the book wasn't really written for a woman, let alone a Black woman. So, you know, so you cannot dismiss it. As a physician, I just cannot do that. I have to take everything into account, sort of check off what I think is not the diagnosis based on the history, because history accounts for 70% of the diagnosis, right? I'm going to ask you questions based on that. You tell me what you're feeling, and then I will order testing to eliminate certain things. And then we figure out what the problem is.
We could go on forever.
Of course.
Like, we could literally just go on forever. And I echo what Nadine said. She was like, just call Dr. Simone and schedule your appointment. Just call. Michele, anything else?
So James, we need to get your contact information for folks that want to know more. How can folks reach you?
Sure. Two ways. One, I have an Instagram account called James Heartbeat. That's pretty much my advocacy page, dealing with my journey, as well as, you know, I post a lot of, you know, verifiable information dealing with cardiovascular disease, specific to our community, more so. And then also, obviously, you can reach me on LinkedIn as well under James L. Young II.
Thank you. Yes, as Crystal said, certainly this is a conversation that could go on and on. A wealth of information shared here tonight. And so we're very grateful to both of you. Again, James, thank you for your transparency and your vulnerability. Dr. Cowan, thank you for sharing the information, answering the question, giving us some things to think about, and most importantly, reminding us to be advocates for ourselves and keep pushing till we get the right answers and not be afraid to move on till you find your Dr. Cowan.
Right. It's my pleasure.
Dr. Cowan, right? Like keep pushing until you find where you're feeling as if you're being heard.
Absolutely.
You can get the absolute best treatment. So preventative, as we get ready to wind this thing up, what are some of the things we should be doing?
So we've got to get mobile. Okay, so I think that the epidemic of obesity and lack of physical activity is just exponential in this country. So we've got to get active. Okay, so typically the recommendation is about 150 hours in a week. So that breaks it down to 30 minutes in a day. If you can do 10 minutes of moderate activity, you're thinking 150 hours in a day. 150 hours in a week. That is classic, right? And that's their minimum, you know? Yeah. If you think you can't possibly do half an hour of moderate activity. So when I say moderate activity, I mean a brisk walk, you can bike briskly, you know, just it's nothing crazy. You're not running a marathon. 30 minutes, 5 days a week, or 10 minutes, 3 times a day, just 10 minutes of brisk walking 3 times a day, just to get some activity in, okay? That will decrease the numbers of obese patients we have, or decrease the incidence of obesity in the country. And you just have to know your numbers. You got to know your numbers. You got to know what's your pressures. You got to know what's normal, where you stand. You got to know your A1C level. Okay, if you're a diabetic, know your A1C level. If you have dyslipidemia or cholesterol problems, know where the upper limits are, know where you stand. Okay, so you can look at your labs and you can understand what you need to do. Okay, so just be an advocate for yourself. This is not about a physician telling you what to do. You have to go in there. This is a partnership that you have with your physician. Okay, this is not mom and child. This is a partnership that you have with your physician, and you're gonna work on your health together. They may have the knowledge base, but you know your body, right? You know your body. So that's the key.
And part of that too is you have to be honest. You can't come in here and say
Absolutely.
drink once a week when you drink a bottle every day. Like,
Absolutely.
Absolutely. James, what do you say to the men?
Well, what I would say to men, number one, because I run into this a lot of people connect me to their family members and their friends and whatnot. And the issue is that a lot of men don't go to the doctor, as it was mentioned earlier on. I was one of those folks as well. I learned my lesson because it almost cost me my life. So that's my story to a lot of the men I talk to. Solidify or confirm a primary care physician. If it's just getting your annual physical done every year, do that. And because we have such a prevalence of cardiovascular disease in our community, it's important for you, and especially if you have family history of it, get a EKG or an echocardiogram done at least once a year if you find that you are vulnerable for that type of condition. Secondly, what I tell people, not only just Black men, but Black women too, is which ties into what the doctor just said, being your own personal advocate. 2 things I do throughout the week. I have a blood pressure monitor device and I have an oximeter, right? And I check my blood pressure. This is about being a self-advocate, being an advocate for yourself. Checking my blood pressure, checking the oximeter to check my pulse rate and my oxygen levels. I do those things periodically, not every day, but periodically. Lastly, I really got to get this in. Everyone, if you have an established primary care doctor, it's important for you to do your family history. Learn about the things that your family have passed from, suddenly or early on in their life. It's very important to do that. That's something my father did before he died. Before he died, he went around the immediate family, found out who everybody died of. And he had me do like a spreadsheet of every person in the family, what they died of, what their ages were, what year, so forth. And I put all that, organized that in the spreadsheet, gave everybody a copy of it. And so everybody gives that to their primary care doctor so it can be on file so they can have a reference.
Wow.
To show like, okay, we see a trend here, or, so it's not just a verbal thing. Or sometimes people don't know. They go to the doctor and they say, well, what's your family history? I don't know what, so having something organized in that sense really helps out a lot. So that was one of the lasting things my father did before he passed away. And I thank him for that.
I just want to echo what James said also. I mean, absolutely, prevention is key. Have a primary care physician that you see at least on a yearly basis. They always draw basic labs. You can pick up something at that time if something is off, and then they can send you to a specialist if need be. Absolutely. You've got to be proactive with your health. And so definitely just, yearly well checks are very important. So.
There's been so much information shared here today. I'm going to echo Nadine again. Just call Dr. Simone and make your appointment. I think, James, what you just said that your father did is something that is key and we need, because that is one question that they always ask you about the health of your family. And a lot of times people just don't know. So I think
Exactly.
that's crucial. So thank you, sir, so much for being as transparent with your story and what you do for advocacy now in this space, because again, 48% of Black women and 44% of Black men have some form of heart disease.
That's right.
And so,
and that number very well may, and the doctor may, chime in on this, but I read an article, a peer-reviewed article, that stated that if we don't make any substantive change with those numbers, it's going to continue to disproportionately increase in years to come. So we might be looking at over 50% at one point if we're not taking any of these progressive steps to address it.
Can I just also add that, 50,000 women die of cardiovascular complications every year. 50,000.
That's a lot.
I want to also say that stroke is the #1 killer of African American women in this country. Stroke is, okay? Of the 48% of those women that you described, Crystal, that have defined cardiovascular disease, 20% of them, the majority of them have hypertension, and only 15 to 20% of that population has controlled blood pressure. So the other 20%, 25% blood pressures are uncontrolled, okay? So I just wanted to leave with that so that you guys had like an idea of the numbers in your head. So we really have to get a hold of this problem, and especially in our community, okay?
So check the comments. I did put the link to Dr. Simone's practice in the comments. Reach out to her. I thank you guys again. This has been awesome. Definitely have to continue this conversation, because there are so many things that you brought up that we were able to just mention and not go into any depth on, that we definitely need to circle back and talk about this year. So I thank you both. We are definitely over time, but it was definitely worth it with what you guys shared. Amazing Women Speak is sponsored by the Amazing Woman Network, which was created to unite and empower Black women, focusing on our core pillars of reclaiming our personal power, mind, body, and spirit, reclaiming our financial power, and increasing our social involvement. And I think what you guys talked about today gave us just a little bit more power to reclaim that personal power, mind, body, and spirit. So I absolutely thank you for that. Next week, be sure to mark your calendars and join us, because the topic's going to be a little different. Sexual habits and relationships, because February is also Sexual Awareness Month. And our guest will be Miss Verna, who owns Goddess Crystal Steam. You all have heard people talk about yoni steams. She'll be here talking about that. And then relationship and intimacy coach Kane Joyland. So be sure to join us next week. Thank you guys again. I definitely appreciate all of the information you shared. I am Crystal Gunn. I am a Black woman, and I own my amazing. Michele.
Thank you both again for this conversation. I am clear that somebody's life is going to get better because of the conversation that we had. So again, I thank you both. Crystal, I continue to and always will in these conversations, thanking you for being obedient to the call that God has put on your life to create a platform for folks to come together and have these conversations and to grow one step closer to really understanding that established at birth that they are amazing Black women, and we should walk into that every single day. I'm so very grateful to share this seat with you. I'm even more blessed to be able to call you my best friend. My name is Michele Harper. I am a Black woman, and I own my amazing. Dr. Cowan.
Well, my name is Simone Cowan. I am a Black woman, and I own my amazing. Thank you, Crystal and Michele. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Yes, I'm James, and I am a Black man. Yeah, I'm a Black man. So, and my mantra to everyone is, as it relates to heart disease, and because most cases of heart disease tend to be chronic related, that tends to be related to lifestyle. Learn what's eating you.
Mm.
And then by learning what's eating you, you can better adjust to what you need to eat to better sustain yourself and have a longer longevity in life.
Seems like I'm gonna hear that statement again somewhere.
I wonder where.
And for the record, we have been doing this now for a year. And James, you are our first male guest.
Wow, really?
Yay.
Absolutely. So I definitely want to thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This has been awesome. We are definitely going to have Dr. Simone back to talk about some of those other issues, and James as well. This information has been great. If you are coming in on the tail end of this, I encourage you to go back and watch the replay on the Amazing Woman Network Facebook page, and tomorrow the YouTube recording will be updated as well. So thank you all again so very much. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday night. Good night, and I'll see you.
All right.
Good night. Thank you.
Take care.